Hi. So tonight I'm reading the living room because I didn't feel like setting up a bunch of stuff in the bedroom. I've got Phil and Lulu out here with me. We've been painting stuff. There's the dog. It's a mess, but that's okay. We were left off. There was a week of prayer that the town was doing, and Father Panaloo was about to give a speech to the people who are not really all that religious. Yes, I know I have a massive zit. People are not very religious, but they're bored as fuck. So, in this exiled quarantine town behind the gates, so they're all outside or hanging out around the church, even though they're not Catholic. They're going to listen to this guy. Father Panaloo stepped into the pulpit. He was a stockily built man of medium height. He leaned on the edge of the pulpit, grasping the woodwork with his big hands, and all one saw was a black, massive torso, and above it 2 rosy cheeks, overhung by steel-rimmed spectacles. He had a powerful, rather emotional delivery, which carried to a great distance, and when he launched to the congregation his opening phrase in clear, emphatic tones, "Calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it." There was a flutter that extended to the crowd massed in the rain outside on the porch. In strict logic, what came next did not seem to follow from this dramatic opening. Only as the sermon proceeded did it become apparent that to the congregation that, by a skillful oratorical device, Father Panaloo had launched at them, like a fist, the gist of his whole discourse. After launching it, he went on at once to quote a text from Exodus, relating to the plague of Egypt, and said, "The first time this scourge appears in history, it was wielded to strike down the enemies of God. Pharaoh set himself up against the divine will, and the plague beat him to his knees." So, from the dawn of recorded history, the scourge of God has humbled the proud of heart and laid low those who hardened themselves against him. Ponder this well, my friends, and fall on your knees. The downpour increased in violence, and these words, striking through a silence intensified by the drumming of raindrops on the chancel windows, carried such conviction that, after a momentary hesitation, some of the worshippers slipped forward from their seats onto their knees. Others felt it right to follow this example, and the movement gradually spread until presently everyone was kneeling from end to end of the cathedral. No sound, except an occasional creak of chairs, accompanied this movement. Then Father Panaloo drew himself up to his full height, took a deep breath, and continued his sermon in a voice that gathered strength as it proceeded. "If today the plague is in your midst, that is because the hour has struck for taking thought. The just man need have no fear, but the evildoer has good cause to tremble. For plague is the flail of God, and the world is his threshing floor. Implacably he will thresh out his harvest until the wheat is separate from the chaff. There will be more chaff than wheat, few chosen and many called. This calamity, though, was not willed by God. Too long this world of ours has contrived at evil. Too long has it counted on the divine mercy and forgiveness of God. Repentance was enough, men thought. Nothing was forbidden. Everyone felt comfortably assured that when the day came he would turn from his sins and repent. Until then, the easiest course was to surrender all along the line. Divine compassion would do the rest. For a long time God gazed down on this town with eyes of compassion, but he grew weary of waiting. His eternal hope was too long deferred, and now he has turned his face from us. And so God's light is withdrawn. We walk in the darkness, the thick darkness of the plague. Someone in the congregation gave a snort, like a restive horse. After a short pause, the preacher continued in a lower tone. We read in the Golden Legend that in the time of King Umberto, Italy was swept by plague, and its greatest ravages took place in Rome and Pavia. So dreadful were these that the living hardly sufficed to bury the dead. And a good angel was made visible to human eyes, giving his orders to an evil angel who bore a great hunting spear, and bidding him strike the houses as many strokes As he dealt a horse, so many dead were carried out of it. Here Panelu stretched forth his two short arms toward the open porch, and as if pointing to something behind the tumbling curtain of rain, said, "My brothers, the fatal hunt is up, and harrying our streets today. See him there, the angel of pestilence, calmly as Lucifer, shining like evil's very self. He's hovering above your roofs with his spear in his right hand, poised to strike, while his left hand is stretched toward one or another house. Maybe at this very moment his finger is pointing toward your door, and the red spear crashing upon its panels. And even now the plague is entering your home and settling down in your bedroom to await for your return. Patient, watchful, ineluctable as the order of the scheme of things, the plague will bide its time. No earthly power, not even, mark me well, the vaunted might of science can avail you to avert that hand once it is stretched toward you. And winnowed like corn on the blood-stained threshing floor of suffering, you will be cast away like chaff." At this point the father reverted with heightened eloquence to the symbol of the flail. He bade the hearers to picture a huge wooden bar whirling above the town, striking at random, swinging up again in a shower of drops of blood and spreading carnage and suffering all over the earth, for the seed time that shall prepare the harvest of truth. At the end of his long phrase, Father Panelu paused, his hair straggling over his forehead, his body shaken by tremors that his hand communicated to the pulpit. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, but vibrant with accusation. "The hour has come for serious thought. You fondly imagined it was enough to visit God on Sunday and make free of your weekdays for business. You believed some brief formality, a bending of a knee, would recompense him well enough for your criminal indifference. But God is not mocked. These brief encounters could not sate the fierce hunger of his love. He wished to see you longer and more often. That is his manner of loving, and indeed the only manner. And this is why, afraid of waiting for you to come to him, he has loosed upon you this visitation, as he has visited every city that offended against him since the dawn of history. Now you are learning your lesson, the lesson learned by Cain and his offspring, by the people of Sodom, by Job and Pharaoh, by all that hardened their hearts against the strangers and against him. And like them, you have seen mankind and all creation with new eyes, since the gates of this city closed on you and the pestilence. Now at last you know the hour has struck to bend your thoughts to first and last things." A wet wind was sweeping up the nave, making the candle flames bend and flicker. The pungency of burning wax, coughs, a stifled sneeze, rose toward Father Panelu, who, reverting to exordium with a subtlety that was much appreciated, went on in a calm, almost matter-of-fact voice. "Many of you are wondering, I know, what I am leading up to. I wish to lead you to the truth, and lead you to rejoice, yes, rejoice, in spite of all I have told you. For advice cannot set you on the right path. Today the truth is merely a command. It is a red spear pointing to the narrow path, the one way of salvation. And so, at last, it is revealed to you. The divine compassion which has ordained good and evil in everything, wrath and pity, the plague and salvation. The same pestilence which is slaying you works for your good and points you to your path. Many centuries ago, the Christians of Abyssinia saw in the plague a sure and God-sent means of winning eternal life. Those who were not yet stricken wrapped around them sheets in which men had died of the plague, so as to make sure of their own death. I grant you, such a frenzied quest of salvation was not commended. It shows an overhaste, a presumptuousness, which we cannot but deplore. No man should seek to hurry God's hand, or to force the appointed hour. And from a practice that aims at speeding up the order of events with which God has ordained, from all time, is a step to heresy. Yet we can learn a lesson from the zeal, excessive though it was, of those Abyssinian Christians. Much of it is alien to our more enlightened spirits, and yet it gives us a glimpse of that radiant eternal light which glows, a small, still flame in the dark core of human suffering. The light, too, illuminates the shadowed path that leads towards deliverance. It reveals the will of God in action, unfailingly transforming evil into good. And so today it is leading us through the dark valley of fears and groans toward a holy silence, the wellspring of all life. This, my friends, is the vast consolation I hold out to you, that when you leave this house of God, you will carry away with you not only words of wrath, but a message of comfort for your hearts. Everyone thought the sermon had ended at this point. Outside, the rain had slowed, and watery sunshine was yellowing the cathedral square. The vague sound of voices came from the streets and a low hum of traffic, the speech of an awakening town. Discreetly, with a subdued rustling, the congregation gathered together their belongings. However, the father had a few more words to say, and he told them that after having made it clear that the plague came from God for the punishment of their sins, he would not have recourse in concluding to an eloquence that, considering the tragic nature of the occasion, would be out of keeping. He hoped and believed that all of them now saw their position in its true light. But before leaving the pulpit, he would like to tell them of something he had been reading in an old chronicle of the Black Death of Marseille. In it, Matthew Marais, the chronicler, laments his loss. He says he has been cast into hell to languish without succor or hope. Well, he was blind. Never more intensely than today had he, Father Paneloux, felt the imminence of divine succor and Christian hope granted to all alike. He hoped against hope that, despite all the horrors of these dark days, despite the groans of men and women in agony, our fellow citizens would offer to heaven a one prayer which is truly Christian, the prayer of love, and God would see to the rest. So that's the end of that section. In the middle of a plague, he's gathered together everyone in the town in one place to yell at them. I'm moving where I'm sitting. Look at my hair, it's terrible. It's hard to say if this sermon had any effect on the townsfolk. The magistrate assured Dr. Rieu that he had found the preacher's arguments absolutely irrefutable. But not everyone took so unqualified a view. To some, the sermon simply brought home the fact that they had been sentenced for an unknown crime to an indeterminate period of punishment. And while a good many people adapted themselves to confinement and carried on their humdrum lives as before, there were others who rebelled, and whose one idea now was to break loose from the prison house. At first, the fact of being cut off from the outside world was accepted with good grace, much as people would put up with any other temporary inconvenience that interfered with only a few of their habits. But now they had abruptly become aware that they were undergoing a sort of incarceration under the blue dome of sky, already beginning to sizzle with the fires of summer. They had a sensation that their whole lives were threatened by the present turn of events, and in the evening, when the cool air revived their energy, this feeling of being locked in like criminals prompted them sometimes to foolhardy acts. It is noteworthy, it may or may not be coincidence, that the Sunday of the sermon marked the beginning of something like a widespread panic in the town, and it took so deep a hold as to lead one to suspect that only now had the true nature of their situation dawned on the townspeople. Seen from this angle, the atmosphere of the town was somewhat changed. But actually, it was a problem of whether the change was in the atmosphere or in their hearts. A few days after the sermon, Dr. Rieu, on his way to one of the outlying districts of the town, was discussing the change with Grand, and collided in the darkness with a man who was standing in the middle of the pavement, swaying from side to side. At the same moment, the street lamps, which were being lit later and later in the evening, came on suddenly, and a lamp just behind Rieu and his companion threw its light on the man's face. His eyes were closed, and he was laughing soundlessly, and drops of sweat were rolling down his face, convulsed with silent merriment. "A lunatic at large," Grand observed. Dr. Rieu took his arm and was shepherding him on, when he noticed that Grand was trembling violently. "If things continue as they are," Rieu remarked, "the whole town will be a madhouse." He felt exhausted and his throat was parched. "Let's have a drink." They went into a small cafe, and the only light came from a lamp over the bar. The heavy air had a curious red tinge, and for no reason, apparently, everyone was speaking in undertones. To the doctor's surprise, Grand asked for a small glass of straight liquor, which he drank at one gulp. Fiery stuff, he observed, and then a moment later suggested making a move. Out in the street, it seemed to Dr. Ryu that the night was full of whispers. Somewhere in the black depths above the street lamps, there was a low sighing that brought to his mind the unseen flail threshing incessantly the languid air of which Father Paneloux had spoken. Happily, happily, Grand said, muttering, and then paused. Ryu asked him what he was going to say. Happily, he said, I have my work. Ah, yes, said Dr. Ryu, that's something, anyhow. Then, so as not to hear that eerie whistling in the air, he asked Grand if he was getting good results. Well, I think I'm making headway. Have you much more to do? Grand began to show an animation unlike his usual self, and his voice took ardor from the liquor he had drunk. I don't know, but that's not the point, Doctor. I can assure you that's not the point. It was too dark now to see clearly. But Ryu had the impression that he was waving his arms around. He seemed to be working himself up to say something, and when he spoke, the words came with a rush. What I really want, Doctor, is this. On the day when the manuscript reaches the publisher, I want him to stand up, after he's read it, of course, and say to his staff, Gentlemen, hats off! Ryu was dumbfounded. And, to add to his amazement, he saw the man beside him making as if to take off his own hat with a sweeping gesture, bringing his hand to his head and then his arm out straight in front of him. The queer whistling and sighing overhead seemed to gather force. So you see, Grand added, it has to be flawless. Though he knew nothing of the literary world, Dr. Ryu had a suspicion that things didn't happen in quite so picturesque a manner. For instance, that publishers do not keep their hats on in the office. But of course one never knew, and Ryu preferred to hold his peace. Try as he might to shut his ears to it, he was still listening to the eerie sound above, the whispering of the plague. They had reached the part of the town where Grand lived, and as it was a slight eminence, they felt the cool night breeze fanning their cheeks, at the same time carrying away from them the noises of the town. Grand continued talking, but Ryu failed to follow anything he was saying. All he gathered was that the work he was engaged on ran to a great many pages, and he was at almost excruciating pains to bring it to perfection. Evenings, whole weeks spent on one word. Just think. Sometimes on a mere conjunction. Grand stopped abruptly and seized the doctor by a button of his coat, and the words came stumbling out of his toothless mouth. I'd like you to understand, Doctor. I grant you it's easy enough to choose between but and and. It's difficult to decide between and then. But the hardest thing is to know whether to put in and or leave it out. Yes, Dr. Ryu said, I see your point. He started walking again. Grand looked abashed, and then stepped forward and drew level. Sorry, he said awkwardly. I don't know what's come over me this evening. Ryu patted his shoulder encouragingly, saying he'd been much interested in what Grand had said, and would like to help him. This seemed to reassure him, and when they reached his place, he suggested, after a hesitation, that the doctor should come in for a moment. Ryu agreed. They entered the dining room, and Grand gave him a chair beside a table strewn with sheets of paper, covered with writing in a microscopic hand, crisscrossed with corrections. That's it, he said in answer to the doctor's questioning glance. But won't you drink something? I have wine. Dr. Ryu declined and was bending over the manuscript. No, don't look, Grand said. It's my opening phrase, and it's giving me trouble. No end of trouble. He, too, was gazing at the paper on the table, and his hand seemed irresistibly drawn to one of them. Finally he picked it up and held it to the electric bulb so that the light shone through. The paper shook in his hand, and Ryu noticed his forehead was covered in sweat. Sit down, he said, and read it to me. Yes. There was gratitude in Grand's eyes. I think I'd like you to hear it. He waited for a while, gazing at the writing, then sat down. Dr. Ryu was listening to the buzzing sound that was rising from the streets as if in answer to the sighing of plague. At that moment, he had a vivid awareness that the town stretched out below, a victimized world secluded and apart, and of the groans of agony stifled in its darkness. Then, pitched low but clear, Grand's voice came to his ears. One fine morning, in the month of May, an elegant young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. Silence returned, and with it the vague murmur of the town. Grand set down the sheet and was staring at it. After a while he looked up. "What do you think of it?" Ryu replied that this opening phrase had whetted his curiosity, and he would like to hear what followed. And then Grand told him he had it all wrong. He was excited and slapped the paper on the table with the flat of his hand. "This is only a rough draft. Once I've succeeded in rendering perfectly the picture in my mind's eye, once my words have the exact tempo of this ride, the horse trotting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. See what I mean? The rest will come more easily. And what's more important, the illusion will be such that from the very first words it will be possible to say, 'Hats off.'" But before that, he admitted, there was a lot of hard work to be done. He'd never dream of handing that sentence to the printer in its present form. For though it sometimes satisfied him, he was fully aware it didn't quite hit the mark. And to some extent, it had a facility of tone, approximating, but recognizably, the commonplace. That more or less what he was saying, when they heard the sound of people running in the street just below the window. Dr. Ryu stood up. "Wait and see what I make of it," Grand said, and glancing out the window, said, "When all this is over." By then the sound of footsteps came again. Dr. Ryu was already halfway down the stairs, and when he stepped into the street, 2 men brushed past him. They were on their way to one of the town gates. In fact, with the heat and the plague, some of the fellow citizens were losing their heads. There had already been some scenes of violence, and nightly attempts were made to elude the sentries and escape to the outside world. That's the end of another section. Let me see what you guys are saying this. I will be saving this one. Yeah, sarcasm. Yeah, a lot of this book is sarcastic. Let me introduce you to what's behind me. I've been working on this forever. I probably won't finish it for a long time. It's colored pencil, so it takes forever. And I've sort of lost interest in it. I don't know why. Skull collection. These are all animals on the bottom shelf here. This is an 18th century European medical specimen skull. It's a woman's skull. This is a taxidermied lamb. Yes, it's real. It's very sweet. We do have implements up there, including a giant scythe, some surgical tools, and a briar horse, and a painting by Erich Daoust. I'll link him and my friend that taxidermied the lamb down in the comments. This is another woman's skull. This is from approximately 1650. There was a cathedral that was being renovated, and outside the cemetery there, this skull was outside the cemetery. It's got indications that there was a brain tumor in the brain pan. She's got some abscess teeth, which is pretty scary. It must have been very painful. But she was relatively young, maybe a little under 30. Oh, and then this is some art from another friend of mine. I'll link them in the comments or in the description too. Oh, and something my grandmother made. I think I'll end on that note. Give me patience now. Yeah, so I will read again tomorrow. We'll pick up with that section and read a few more. I'm going back to painting. I'm hoping to finish today's expressionist painting before I post this. So, good night, everyone. Stay safe, stay alive, and stay inside. And I'll see you tomorrow.